Welcome to the Modern Maker Workroom, Season 3, Episode 17. In this episode, we're going to prepare the center fronts to hold the bone. We'll learn how to pick stitch it and put some lacing rings into the front so that the garment will close beautifully. As you see, the center front has already been pressed back, and we are about to make the bar tack to secure the bottom of the bone. We begin by securing the thread just below the waistline seam. Now here I am using a T60 sewing thread, so that's equivalent to like jeans top stitching thread, so heavier than you would normally stitch with. And I'm securing this thread nice and tight, and what you just saw me doing was making a little bit of a bar tack at the bottom where the bone will stop so that it doesn't slide all the way down. And then, as I work my way up to the neck, I'm working with a cross stitch. Now, if you haven't seen a cross stitch before, you can refer to the Modern Maker Volume 3 Hand Sewing Stitches for Garment Construction, or you can look on YouTube for the cross stitch demonstration. I continue to use this cross stitch, which secures and covers the cut edge of the fabric. I'll continue this all the way up to the top. And then when I'm done, I will secure it and knot it off. Now that the tail has been knotted off and clipped, I will move on to pressing the center front. One of the steps that we'll need to do next is to remove the center front basting to make sure that we're not getting it stuck in the stitches that we're about to execute. And since our center front is now sewn, we no longer need these basting stitches, so they can be removed. Now that they're gone, I'm going to grab the iron and give this a nice steamy press. Now make sure that you don't stretch this as you work. You want to preserve the shaping that you've executed at center front. If you've done your job well, this shouldn't have any risk of stretching whatsoever, but you don't want to force a fresh shape into it either. Now I'm preparing the piece of boning to go into the casing at center front, and if you'll notice, it actually extends below the waistline, and this is to give a little bit more support and allow the doublet to hang nicely from the front skirt. This boning is available from Burnley and Trowbridge Associates, who are among the foremost suppliers of goods for making historical clothing. I'm using my scissors to cut it, and then I trim the ends carefully into a rounded tip so that they don't work their way through the fabric by cutting the material. You'll also notice that the curve is placed towards the body rather than away from the body, and this helps counteract the pressure of the body on the outside of the garment. I'm working past the seam allowance at the waist, making sure that the bone extends below it slightly. It's about an inch below, and then once the boning is in, then I will give it a little bit of a press, and this reduces the curvature just a little bit and allows the garment to mold the bone into the angle that it needs to be. And here you go. Once this is complete, then I have to make a little end tack at the top to keep the bone from sliding up into the neckline. This just keeps the bone from moving and allows it to stay secure. We've made bar tacks at the top and the bottom of this bone, but now we want to make sure that we secure it widthwise. So what we'll do to keep it pulled tight into the fold at center front is we are going to use a pick stitch to make some very small tight stitches right next to the bone. Now as I work, I'm really shoving the bone into the fold at the front, and I'm forcing the needle as tight next to it as possible. And you can see, because the bone prevents me from scooping my stitch efficiently, I'm actually using a stabbing motion back and forth. Now if you're not familiar with the pick stitch, in this instance, I'm using a back stitch version of the pick stitch. So each stitch is just a teeny tiny prick on the outside, but the motion is very much like a back stitch. So it's going behind the exit point of the thread, behind the fabric layers, and then out ahead of it, so that there's just a bunch of little teeny tiny divots right along the edge of the bone. And in some paintings, particularly Dutch paintings, you can actually see divots like this along the edge of the center front. Painters often render shadows very accurately because they're just painting what they see. This pick stitch will extend all the way from top to bottom of the bone, and then we'll stop at the bottom of the bone. We don't really need to continue it down into the skirt. And here we are, just taking the final stitches and making sure that everything is secure and in place. Now before we move on, we need to close the remainder of the front of the lining. So let's close the remainder of the lining here. I'm going to secure my thread up underneath the seam allowance of the body and then come up where I need to take my stitch through the actual lining material. I'm very sorry about the blown out whiteness of the lining material. I'm still learning the lighting requirements of my new studio space. And securing the lining in is simply a matter of taking a few extra stitches along the edge to fill the lining in place. And we're going to extend the lining all the way across the waistline seam to the top of the turned back seam allowance on the inside of the garment. Later, we'll put the body lining in and it'll match up really nicely. So I'm just giving this a final press here before we move on to the next step. But as I lay this down here, it's really good to look at this shape at center front. You can see the curvature of the bust hollow right there next to the bone, and that's something that's very important for this to fit well. So to mark these placements, I'm starting right even with the seam at the bottom, and then I'm using 2 finger widths apart to place the marks. And I'll do this all the way up to the top, and then I'll mark the corresponding side. Now I'm using 3/8 inch diameter metal rings, which I most often find at places which sell supplies for making blinds, for like making Roman blinds. Sometimes the rings they sell are plastic, but if you're lucky you can find the metal ones. Anytime I find metal rings, these have to be sealed metal rings. They can't have a cut through them. But anytime I find them, I buy a whole bunch and keep them in my kit because I never know when I'm going to see them again. If you know metal workers who are really quite skilled, you can have them make some for you. Now, notice these bottom 2 marks that I just put are right next to each other. There's a half distance one at the bottom, and that's because we'll be lacing this closed with a spiral zigzag kind of lacing, so we need to have them offset. But in order for the top and bottom to sit parallel to each other, even, the 2 rings need to be right across from each other to tie closed. So the top and bottom ring marks will be in a slightly different position. So there's the ring itself. Now I'm going to put this so that a little bit of the ring is extended out. The back portion of the ring will actually be covered by the lining material of the body once it goes in. And you'll notice that I'm stabbing all the way through the garment, working kind of right on top of my pick stitches, and that's because if I don't, the tendency will be for this ring to pull at the under layers and then the front will gap. So to avoid that, I make sure that 3 or 4 of these stitches go all the way through to the outer layer. Now I'm making sure that the stitches themselves kind of hide in the divots that I have already stitched for my pick stitching that keeps the bone in place. But without this, the front will not be secure and it won't be able to lace closed, especially if you prefer wearing a doublet very tight over your stays. It's not going to close very well. So I have plenty of thread on my needle, and I'm just going to travel the needle under the layers to the next location for the ring. This process continues in exactly the same way. You can see that I'm leaving maybe 1/8 of an inch to even less, like 3/32 of an inch, to the folded edge of the fabric. My first 2 stitches are getting stabbed all the way through, and then I'll take a few stitches just on the back surface to help secure the ring. And you'll see that I try to wrap as much of the ring as I possibly can. I'm not really worried about, covering it completely, but I'm taking a lot of stitches for security. These rings will be under a lot of tension. And now that I'm at the other side of the ring, again, I'm going to do a couple of stitches that are all the way through the material. And you'll see that I'm lining them up with the divots from my pick stitching. Now these stitches also help secure the bone, so you're doing an extra layer of security stitches holding the bone and the rings in place together. I will say that just from experience lacing this garment up on the mannequin, the rings behind the bone, when they're done right, it's actually kind of hard to get the cord through in the right place. There's a special way to hold it that sort of pries open the space between the ring and the bone, but if you've done your job well, it actually won't have any tendency to gap, and it will almost look like it's closed by magic. Here are some close-up shots of the ring application, so you can see that it's secured on the edges, and then I'm showing you the cross stitching that goes along the front as well, and the placement of the marks. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Modern Maker Workroom. This is what the lacing looks like when it's going on, and you can see that as it's closed, it just looks as though it's closed by magic. You don't even notice the lacing ring underneath. We have this nice smooth shape on the mannequin. Thank you so much for joining us. I can't wait to show you the next episode. Please follow us on Instagram at mnagidesign. Visit or subscribe to themodernmaker.co or our Patreon on patreon.com/themodernmaker. Thank you so much, and as always, happy stitching.